When a serial killer is captured, there's an elite band of experts called upon by the police to help interview the deadliest category of murderer. Psychologists, psychiatrists, and profilers, they are men and women who have spent their entire working lives face to face with some of the most dangerous killers the world has ever known.
Too many similarities for the question not to be asked, and for you not to say why.
No comment.
No comment.
They paint the image that I was this monster who picked up like these altar boys along the street and swatted them like flies. I said, this is ludicrous.
I am sorry for all the pain that my actions have caused. I am prepared to die if you say it is necessary.
After working for decades intimately with the most violent people alive, our experts have developed the skills to protect themselves.
If you don't distance yourself, it will get to you over time.
I do not want some of the stuff going through their minds to be running around inside mine.
Every time that you are called upon to do it, you have to take a deep breath and you have to go back into that darkness.
Now, for the first time, these experts have come together to see if there are any common factors in the lives of serial killers that have pushed seemingly ordinary men and women to commit this most heinous of crimes.
I don't believe anyone is born a serial killer.
We need to know the motivation and what they're getting out of it.
What's feeding their fetishes?
Lack of love, lack of family bonding, lack of affection, punishment.
Could these combined factors reach a breaking point that could push the individual over the edge and help us understand what it takes to make a monster?
Serial killing is the malign waste product of a dysfunctional culture.
In a maximum security prison cell in Yorkshire, a woman who waged a murderous campaign over 2 decades will see the end of her days. Rose West and her husband Fred formed one of the most infamous serial killing couples in British criminal history. Between them, they claimed the lives of at least 12 young women, including 2 of their own children. Their home on Cromwell Street, Gloucester, was dubbed the House of Horrors by the tabloids after the discovery of bodies buried in the cellar and garden.
On the other side of that narrow wooden door, there was a viper's nest of depravity. And Fred was the scorpion, and Rose was the spider. Between them, they very quickly became a killing machine. They were now set on the road to total depravity.
Since her arrest over 25 years ago, Rose West has deflected all attempts by the police for psychologists to speak to her. There is only one man she's ever agreed to talk to. He's the crime writer Brian Masters, who would go on to write an acclaimed book about her trial called She Must Have Known. This is the first time he's ever discussed their meeting.
I met Rosemary West after the conclusion of her trial. What was so astonishing about her was that she was so ordinary. She had short black hair. She just got on with what she was doing, which was knitting. And I said, how do you spend your time here in prison? She said, oh, I'm always knitting for my grandchildren. I've got lots of them now, so it keeps me busy. I gathered from that meeting, the only meeting I had with her, that she was first of all unsure of herself, secondly embarrassed by the entire circus which has surrounded her name, and thirdly that she did not really know how to interpret what had happened.
What had happened was that after presiding over a 20-year reign of sadistic cruelty, torture and death, 25 Cromwell Street, Rose and her husband Fred had been unmasked as Britain's worst serial killing couple. In February 1994, when West's wicked world came crumbling down, Rose had good reason to think she would get away with murder, because all the initial police attention was on Fred. As the full horrors of the crimes unraveled, however, the police called on the services of renowned criminal profiler Paul Britton. This is the first time he's ever discussed his involvement in the case.
I went to Gloucester and I met with the SIO and the deputy and several others, and they outlined a case that had happened in the house at Cromwell Street, and he came, he asked if I could help them to make sense of a man who they were having difficulty interviewing. This man was Frederick West. And the situation was that he had accidentally, unintentionally if you like, killed a couple of young women, his daughter and others, and instead of doing as he should have done, which was to declare it, he was frightened about the outcome and had simply buried them in the garden under the patio. At that stage there was no mention of Rosemary West, Mrs. West. But what I knew, again from the literature and from clinical experience, is that there would be other people who had been taken and killed. And so I had to tell the officers, you were looking at two people who had probably been killing for many years, and that there would be other bodies to be found.
Within days of Fred West's arrest, Paul Britton's predictions would be proven correct, and Rose West was brought in for questioning. She flatly denied any knowledge of the crimes. But as Paul Britton and the police began looking into the past, a disturbing picture began to emerge.
I think you're looking at a quite striking series of events and circumstances that brings her, through her childhood and adolescence, to become a serial murderer.
Rose West was born in Devon in 1953, the fifth of 7 children. When Rose's parents decided to separate, she chose to stay with her mother, only to come home one day to find her mother had disappeared. Devastated, Rose was forced to move to Bishop's Cleeve near Cheltenham with 2 of her brothers and her schizophrenic father. Rose would soon find herself forced into an incestuous relationship with her father.
Rosemary had sexual intercourse with her father, quite often, even before pubescence. She was unable to question it. At that age, you don't know what's happening, so you just do what Daddy says you do.
I recall seeing a quote from her father as saying something to the effect of, you know, I made you, therefore I can do what I like with you. Well, that's a very proprietorial, very dominant view of relationships. It's not a two-way relationship at all. It's really very authoritarian, but also very focused on sexual activity.
That kind of sets the standard for what you expect a relationship to be. So if your relationship with your parents is an abusive one, then it kind of encourages the belief that abusive relationships are actually normal.
Dr. Adrian Needs has worked as a principal psychologist for the prison service, specializing in helping murderers come to terms with why they killed.
And I guess it's that growing up in an incestuous environment is going to have a major impact upon how relationships are understood. This will have given a distorted idea of family relationships and about the nature of intimacy, and there did seem to be a focus of everything on sex, and it seems that increasingly she came to devote herself to that kind of thing.
Apparently, she was extraordinarily precocious sexually, and by the time she was in puberty, she was walking around the house in front of her father and brothers completely naked, and an active and involved partner in this incest, not just with her father, but laterally with her two brothers, who she also sexually abused.
Rose's craving for sexual satisfaction regularly led her to trawling the pubs of the nearby city of Gloucester. In November 1968, she was returning home, and whilst waiting for a bus, she met a man who would change her life forever. His name was Frederick Walter Stephen West.
Still only 15, Rose met a much older man called Fred West, who was 27.
He picked her up at a bus stop, but she got away. And he persisted and sought her out again. And then she realized, or thought she realized, that this was the chance to escape home. And he would be loving and protective towards her, and he would give her a nice family home life. So as soon as she was 16, she went.
It was a mutual attraction. At the time they met, they were both quite good looking. I suppose she might have thought that he was relatively straightforward. I don't know if she knew right at the beginning how she would develop. Probably not.
As their relationship blossomed, it was not long before the young couple realized they shared some very dark passions and extreme sexual fantasies, which together they could fulfill.
Very quickly in their relationship, Fred introduced her to pornography, to prostitution, to sadism, and she took to it readily. She had never acquired a conscience, a sense of morality. For her, sex was a natural act that you would commit indiscriminately. And for Fred, violence and pornography was something that he took to actively and quite well.
Just like Brady and Hindley, they had a common interest and they had a common bond, just like that. And so as a consequence, would have taken off together, and indeed did.
I think that if Rose West had had a different life, had met someone else, taken a different partner, there is very little chance that she would have become Rose West, the serial murderer that we know. It's only when she met and tied up with Fred West that those things were sent in the direction that brought her to destruction and so many others. When she met him, she sat on the edge of a slide and was pushed down it, and really, once she was underway, even though she always had the choice, there was no real likelihood that she was ever going to get off.
In 1970, aged just 16, Rose fell pregnant by Fred. He set them up in a family home at 25 Midland Road in Gloucester, and they were joined by Fred's daughter Anne-Marie and stepdaughter Charmaine. Whenever they could, they would pass the children over to a babysitter so that they could give full flight to their sexual fantasies. Behind closed doors, the full dynamic of the relationship was quickly established. One where they had power and control over the vulnerable, whom they lured to the house.
What do they get from each other? What is it that makes this unholy partnership become real? Well, I think there are two things. Frederick West needed to control people. He needed to feel potent and powerful. He also liked women. He liked to womanize. And what he found is a girl who was emotionally and sexually pliable. She's a girl who had already been introduced to sexual possibilities, but when she became an item with Frederick West, those doors were opened and pushed far and wide. She was introduced, at first conceptually, to sadism, humiliation, torture, bondage, a whole range of activities that for many people would have pulled the shutters down, but they didn't for her. And they didn't because those normal barriers hadn't been put in place. What was happening is she was with a man who seemed to love her, who seemed to care for her, who seemed to take her for herself. She felt important.
The tensions in the West household at Midland Road began rising when Fred was arrested and imprisoned for petty theft and given a 10-month term in November 1970. Rose was now alone and the true matriarch of the house. Mother to 3 girls, she had difficulty controlling 8-year-old stepdaughter Charmaine. She was about to cross a threshold from which there could be no turning back.
Rose was abusing this girl and bullying her, and this girl was becoming defiant and talking back. That actually triggered Rose to kill this girl.
I think Charmaine's murder actually really did cross a Rubicon for the two of them. It showed Fred what Rose was capable of on her own, and he found that really exciting, I've no doubt. It becomes really crucial when Charmaine died, because if Fred was in prison, it must have been Rose who killed her. She can't blame Fred for this murder. And that's why it's so important that it shows Rose's own violent, murderous temperament.
I think once that threshold was crossed, then it probably makes it easier to escalate the harm in subsequent episodes.
When Fred was released from prison, he entombed the body of Charmaine in concrete in an old garage pit in Midland Road, where she would lie undiscovered for over 25 years. It is highly likely that by this time, Fred would have revealed to Rose that he had already carried out a double murder, having killed his previous wife, Rena, and their nanny, Anne McFall, who was pregnant with his child. But they were now about to take their next steps together to becoming a killing couple who shared and justified to one another their sick desires.
I think that when Frederick West and Rosemary came together, they developed what we call a codependency. So in some important ways, they each became dependent on the other. They each gave validation, gave meaning to the other's possibilities.
In January 1972, Rose and Fred West married. Within months, Rose was pregnant with their second child, and they moved to a bigger home at 25 Cromwell Street.
Either by accident or design, they chose an ideal location, didn't they? Because it's a fairly run-down area of the city, and it was big enough to let them both rent out rooms at the top of the house, and also for them to have a sort of special sexual area of the house in Rosemary's room.
Despite its incongruous facade, the house quickly became a notorious venue for sex parties hosted by Fred and Rose. And Fred pimped Rose out, selling her sexual services for as little as £5 a time to lorry drivers and travelling salesmen he found in local pubs.
I know that she enjoyed a wide range of omnivorous sexual pleasures, and I know that she had all sorts of guests who she entertained upstairs in the bedroom where there were cameras and all sorts of things.
She was actively engaged as a prostitute. That prostitution included having 3 of her 8 children by other fathers who were clients. Fred encouraged the prostitution. Fred filmed the prostitution. Fred watched the prostitution. Her father came back into to the scene, and she was having sex with her father.
The couple by now were having sex with as many as 30 different people a week. And everything in this supposed family home was geared towards facilitating their deviant behaviour.
It was all set up so the activities could be conducted in a way that would give them the maximum pleasure. On Rose's floor, where she entertained her male clientele, it was always about the two of them. It was set up so that Fred could be observing, could look through spy holes to see what was going on.
Voyeurism is, in essence, I suppose, at the back of it, is a fear of sexual encounter. You look at somebody else having sex, which is sexually stimulating to you, but keeps you out of it so that you don't mess up, get involved, you know, come up against problems that you didn't think you could overcome. Rosemary would encourage Fred during the sexual exploits to enjoy himself a little bit more. She saw it as her business to keep him happy at that level.
Indeed, it was Fred's love of sexual spying, or voyeurism, that's one of the key indicators that it was Rose who really took the lead in the relationship and used it to exert her control over him. Any form of conventional sexual activity would quickly lose all its attraction for the couple, and they began to seek out partners for more extreme sex, be they willing or unwilling participants.
I suppose this form of sexual activity that increasingly they became engaged in was very demeaning. It was where they had to be in control, and it involved binding and gagging.
It soon became apparent that Rose's room was not suitable for the extreme sexual encounters the couple craved. So Fred decided to fashion his own sex dungeon in the Cromwell Street basement. The space allowed them to fulfill their full potential as brutal sexual sadists.
I think it's important and helpful to know what sadistic fantasies are, what sadistic means. It doesn't just mean aggressive sex. For it to be sadistic, a person needs to get their sexual pleasure from the control of another person, where that other person is suffering and enduring pain, and it is that part of it that gives the sadist the sexual pleasure that they then get.
The sex dungeon that Fred had fashioned out of the basement at Cromwell Street would be the place where many of West's victims would die. Rose and Fred were soon set on a campaign to find as many young women as they could to lure back to the house to sexually torture. But their first victim was to be found much closer to home. 17-year-old local girl, Caroline Owens. She had been a nanny to their children, but one night found herself enticed into the cellar and coerced into one of Fred and Rose's sex games.
She makes her escape and goes to the police. And unfortunately, and she regrets this to this day, she had to say to them, I can't possibly go through a trial on all of this. I can't, it's too horrible. The Wests were done on a much lesser charge of indecent assault, which didn't require her to give evidence. And we know that Rose West was instigating the crimes that went on in that house.
I think that was a really important pivotal turning point for the couple, because they realised that actually they'd made a massive mistake, and then from then on in they needed to silence their victims.
Just 4 months after the assault of Caroline Owens in December 1972, the Wests were to claim their first known victim at the House of Horrors. 19-year-old Linda Gough, one of their lodgers, was lured to the Cromwell Street basement and would never live to tell the tale.
The relationship between Fred and Rose and Linda Gough is quite fascinating. In a sense, she got more into that group and was obviously involved in it almost willingly, but jealousies were then set up. And I think this link between violence and domination and sex became crucial in that killing, because Rose maybe felt that her domination of the scene was beginning to wane.
When you look at the murders of Rose, while the violence that was used in them was very expressive, the deaths were almost an afterthought.
The couple's insatiable desires drove them to scour the local area in search of further victims, with Rose leading the way.
Rose did show a very manipulative side to her in her expeditions with Fred, where they would cruise around in the car and pick up lost-looking young women from bus stops and so forth. And the women would be reassured, I think, by the presence of another woman, and one who seemed vaguely maternal and was probably making lots of positive noises. Must have seemed quite reassuring, but it does show an ability to act, really, because she knew what the intentions were, she knew what was coming.
Within 12 months of the murder of Linda Gough, the Wests had killed 3 further victims: Carol Ann Cooper, Lucy Partington, and Teresa Seigenthaler, all thought to be picked up by the couple whilst hitchhiking or journeying home. Fred and Rose were by now the ultimate killing couple. But Rose was far from satisfied, always looking to push the boundaries.
The problem is that a victim only lasts so long. They tire of a victim, she dies, there is more to be done. Her response isn't quite what they look for, so we'll get someone else. The fear isn't quite right. Enough is never enough. Enough is never, there is no end. It was originally thought that Frederick West was probably the driving force. And I think what he was really was the liberating force, because Rosemary West was much brighter than Frederick West. And within a relatively short time, they became an equal partnership. And in many ways then, she surpassed him in the control and the need for sexual depravity.
Indeed, Rose no longer saw the victims as human beings. They were sex objects to be played with and discarded at will.
Sex became all-consuming for them, and the issue was how to get more and more out of it with a limited supply. And it's that that fuels the escalating torture and desecration of the victims.
Sometimes people who commit bad acts against others do engage in, well, dehumanizing, seeing them as less than human, sometimes seeing them as almost deserving, or certainly not as counting. And in that kind of mindset, it does become easier for somebody to inflict very serious harm against somebody else. And the more they do it, the more it becomes normal.
The only way you can become a serial killer is to have that detachment. You know, if you don't have that detachment, if you're horrified so much by what you've done, you're probably not going to progress in any meaningful way. You have to have that psychopathic lack of concentration and understanding of people.
Rose and Fred's reign of terror continued undetected for more than a decade, until their unwanted attentions turned to their own children.
I think it's a misunderstanding to think that 25 Cromwell Street was ever really a family home. It was a house where people lived, where children had to stay. But remember, those children in the main lived in fear. It is Rose West who is preparing the children very forcibly for their father's sexual attentions, and that she herself is going to be involved in. You have a person, in this case a woman, who broke all of the rules and the expectations of motherhood. This is a person who you would normally expect to protect her children, to die for her children, to protect them if necessary. This is a person who you would expect to have stood between them and a sexual predator. But in fact, the reverse was true. She actually took on each of those roles so that the children became depersonalized. They became objects that were there simply for her pleasure and Frederick's pleasure.
I'm not sure what Rosemary's concept of motherhood really was. She said she wanted a big family, but I'm not sure what she felt she had to do really as a mother. She talks about providing for them, and she certainly got very angry when she felt they weren't being properly appreciative.
Inevitably, given Rose's behaviour and activities, tensions with her 8 children would develop, especially when they reached their teens. It wouldn't be long before their eldest daughter, Heather, began fighting back, a defiance which would lead her to become the second of Fred West's daughters to be murdered.
It seems that Rose had a bit of a problem with her temper and often interacted in a rather angry way with her children. Interestingly, she seemed to put the blame upon them rather than her own demeanour. Well, I think the constantly present sexual overtones in the household that did affect her own children, really, that probably was a continuation of the sexualised sort of environment that she'd had when she was growing up.
Despite the warning signs, Rose and Fred's behaviour went largely unnoticed and unchecked by the authorities.
Social services have received a lot of criticism, and certainly as you look back, you can see children going to school covered in bruises, showing signs of severe distress, showing evidence of being sexually abused, and yet the social services were not able to intervene in a house that was also known to be associated with prostitution. Why that was the case, I don't know. But it seems to me that Fred was always prepared to go to the social services as the father, or the nominal father, to express his love, to say that he would care for these children, and Rose was prepared to back him up.
Now, these are not people who looked as though they were predatory psychopaths. They just looked ordinary. Their activities were out of plain sight. People think it was in plain sight, but it wasn't. They were able to take their victims, they were able to bind them, gag them, break their teeth. They were able to put tubes into them to keep them alive for days, suspend them from hooks, do the most dreadful things to them. But because the nature of the building shielded the sound and everything else, nobody knew.
The house was set up so that the entrance was actually on the side of the house, not on the main street, and the street lighting on that street was really bad at that particular point. So even something small about the environment like that helped facilitate that dangerous transition, if you like, from getting a live victim from the control of a vehicle back to Cromwell Street into the house. And that was without neighbours seeing anything, which is quite extraordinary because it was a typical street. It was only a few hundred yards from a busy shopping centre.
The murder that would ultimately bring the West's reign of terror to an end was that of their own daughter, Heather. She mysteriously disappeared following an altercation with her parents in June 1987.
They played tapes of Frederick West, tapes of his interviews with police, and the question of Heather, their daughter, came up, and Heather had disappeared. The family had always maintained she'd simply left home, as she promised she would. She wanted to leave home for a long time because she loathed being interfered with by her father all the time.
Heather might have been about to blow the gaff There might have been something precipitant like that brought about her death.
He'd killed one of his own daughters because he was afraid that she would go to the authorities. He buried that daughter in the garden and then threatened his other children with saying that they would have the same fate if they didn't behave.
16-year-old Heather was murdered and buried underneath the patio. Rose and Fred told the other children that Heather had left for a job in Devon. She was never seen or heard from again.
I think under any definition, Rose and Fred's household was dysfunctional, but to threaten your other children that they'll end up under the patio like Heather is just a terrible, forceful thing to do. It's domination again, it's control. And that weaves into this triangle: violence, domination, and sex, because there was undoubtedly all three taking place within all those relationships in that house.
Eventually, one of the friends of one of the daughters told her mother what was happening, and the mother went to the police. But ultimately, even when they had all the evidence, it took the police 2 years to eventually arrive at convictions.
The sickening crimes that took place behind the doors of 25 Cromwell Street remained undetected until the 26th of February, 1994, when the body of Heather West was finally unearthed by police from under the patio. A week later, the bodies of further victims were finally discovered, buried in the garden and cellar of Cromwell Street. The full extent of their depravity became apparent when their tools of torture were found buried near to their victims.
One which always haunts me is a mask which has nothing but 2 nose holes in it so that the person can breathe. You can't see, you can't hear, and as a consequence, you can have anything done to you. And that's very frightening indeed. And their obvious discomfort here and not wanting it to happen are the very meat and drink of sexual sadists.
Police were particularly puzzled as to why West had turned his back garden into a graveyard, substantially increasing the chances of eventual discovery. They turned to forensic psychologist Paul Britton for answers.
The question was asked, well, why ever would the bodies be buried in the garden? My answer was, well, they're in the garden because the house is full. And what that meant is that these are people who keep their treasures close to them, and their treasures were the people they tortured and murdered.
Rose went before Gloucester Magistrates Court on the 30th of June 1994, charged with the murders of 10 young women, including that of her own daughter Heather and stepdaughter Charmaine. The case against her was strengthened by the fact that Fred couldn't have killed his stepdaughter Charmaine whilst in prison. But the most damning evidence of all came from the West's only surviving victim, Caroline Owens. Following his arrest, to try and protect Rose, Fred claimed that he had carried out the murders alone, a line which she was all too willing to go along with. Even to the end, she retained her power and control over him.
You saw it in court. If they brushed past each other in the witness box, she made sure that he never got within touching distance. His hand went out to reach her once, and she insisted on being apart, so he couldn't touch her. She broke all contact with him of any kind.
They apparently made a pact beforehand that Fred would take all the blame, so in a sense she was simply going along with the agreed line. I think Fred was upset that she seemed a bit more convincing about it than he'd anticipated. Also, it was clear at that point that things had come to an end. So in a sense, he'd kind of lost some of his value to her.
Shortly after being rejected by Rose in court on the 1st of January 1995, whilst on remand, Fred West was found dead in his prison cell.
He was more dependent on her than she was on him, and that would have been true throughout the majority of their time together, I think.
In October 1995, Rose was found guilty of 10 murders and sentenced to 25 years for her crimes. 2 years later, the then Home Secretary, Jack Straw, increased Rose's 25-year sentence to life without the prospect of parole. It was only the second time such a whole life tariff had been imposed on a woman, the first being Myra Hindley. Rose West has refused to confess to the murders and protests her innocence to this day.
It's interesting that she hasn't cooperated in any discussion about the offences since then. I suppose it's easier to blame Fred because he's no longer around, so we'll never know.
This is a person who received a whole-of-life sentence. This is a person who the authorities have said will never come out of prison. What motivation is there for her to say, yes, it's true, I did it? Even if she were to make that acknowledgement, it's not really going to change whether or not she comes out of prison. Everything that she has left makes it important that she tries to maintain this image of herself and pass it on to people who are now her friends and peers in prison, because her future is now very much in their estimation, and many of those people despise and really are quite unpleasant towards people who harm and kill young people, children.
The question still remains, was Rose West born a monster? Or did her horribly premature introduction to deviant sexuality via the incestuous relationship with her father preordain her descent into depravity and murder?
Was she a person who had all of the benefits, all of the gains that we would like people to have, and nevertheless went on to kill? No, she wasn't. She's a person who was herself abused, herself offended against, but nevertheless chose to develop that dark, what we would call evil side of her personality.
Would Rose have committed these crimes if she hadn't met Fred? I don't think she would. I think she would have been an immoral, sluttish prostitute, but she might have actually married someone else and had a completely different life. But I don't think she would have killed if she hadn't met Fred. But that doesn't exonerate her. The problem in trying to make sense of it is that we persist in trying to apply our values to understanding it. We continue to try and impose our kind of moralistic template on these people. They are outside those conditions of understanding.
So if the question is, at the core of that, is there still a person? The answer is probably. But the next question is that a person that you can ever reach? Is that a person that you can ever reach in, hold their hand, and bring them back? I would be very surprised. Remember, everyone thinks it's done, it's over. But it probably isn't. There are more Rose Wests. We don't know who they are, we don't know where they are. And there are almost certainly more people that were hurt by the Wests that we don't yet know about.
When I met her in prison, she did say one thing, not in answer to prompting from me. She said, look, I did realise quite early on that Fred was no good, but I didn't know that he would have gone that far. I left it at that.